It was late September when I headed out solo for a weekend camping trip deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. I had some time off, and I wanted a quiet stretch in the woods where I didn't have to talk to anyone or hear any noise besides wind through the trees. That area is full of unmarked game trails and crisscrossing ATV paths. I had a decent map and a GPS, and I'd camped alone plenty of times before, so I wasn't worried. I parked my truck at a forest access point, just a rough pull-off next to a creek, and hiked in a few miles. It was a place I'd marked out months ago, a small hollow with a spring and plenty of flat space to pitch a tent. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and made some coffee. Everything felt normal. The woods were thick, green, and quiet. There was no cell signal, but I expected that. On my second day, I went exploring further uphill. The terrain was steep and covered with old oak and hickory, and under the canopy it stayed pretty cool. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't on my map. There were metal barrels lined up behind some brush, and a crude wooden lean-to built up against a slope. It didn't take long to figure out what I was looking at. A still. Not some antique display or decorative moonshine setup. This was functional and active. It reeked of sour mash and smoke, and the fire underneath was still smoldering. There were signs someone had been there very recently. Fresh boot prints in the mud. Some tools leaned against a stump. I froze up. I remembered all those old stories about people stumbling across stills and disappearing. It was probably just paranoia, but the idea of being watched crept in fast. My first instinct was to get the hell out of there. But I'd read about that rumor, the one where if you come across a still and think someone might be watching, you can throw a log on the fire as a kind of peace gesture. A way to show you're not a threat. Like saying, "Hey, I see what this is, and I'm not about to call the cops." I didn't really believe it. It sounded like the kind of thing you read online from people who've watched too many movies. But when you're deep in the woods and your gut tells you you're not alone, your brain starts grasping for anything that might keep things calm. So I did it. I found a decent-sized log, walked slowly over to the fire under the mash barrels, and set it on top. I didn't hear anything. No movement, no voices, no reaction at all. But I felt something, a kind of pressure in the air, like I just passed some invisible test. I backed away slowly, kept my hands visible, and walked back the way I'd come. The rest of the hike back to camp was uneventful, but the hairs on the back of my neck never settled down. I kept thinking about whether someone had been watching me, and if they had, what they'd taken away from what I'd done. Maybe they appreciated the gesture. Or maybe they thought I knew too much. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed in the tent and kept my headlamp off. I listened hard. Every squirrel in the leaves and every gust of wind had me twitching. I kept imagining footsteps circling my camp. Someone crouched in the dark nearby with a rifle across their lap. I barely slept. When first light came, I packed up fast and hit the trail back to the truck. My route was straightforward, but I noticed small things. Tree branches cracked, a set of prints in a muddy stretch of trail that weren't there when I came through. Could have been anyone, could have been nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. At the truck, everything was as I left it. No flat tires, no broken windows. I tossed my gear in the bed, climbed in, and started driving. The forest thinned out in the mirror behind me. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles out and had signal again. Looking back, I don't know if putting the log on the fire really helped. I don't know if anyone was there at all, but I do know that spot had an active still and someone was maintaining it. I know I wasn't supposed to see it. Whether or not the fire gesture is real, whether or not it makes you complicit, I think it sends a message. I'm not a threat and I'm not interested in causing trouble. It's easy to mock those rumors until you're out in the woods with no one around and a fresh path in the leaves that wasn't there before. Then it stops being a story and becomes a decision you have to make. Right then, right there. Maybe it saved me. Maybe I was lucky. I haven't been back to that part of the mountains. There are plenty of other trails. But every time I go out now, I carry a little extra caution. And I always pay attention to the smells: yeast, mash, smoke. If I ever catch a whiff of sour corn again, I'll turn around without making a sound. Once was enough. So yeah, maybe it's just a rumor, but if it keeps you alive, that might be all that matters. I'll never forget that trip. I've been camping all my life, but nothing prepared me for what I stumbled on in the mountains of East Tennessee one summer. I grew up not far from the Smoky Mountains. I've always known the mountains were beautiful but rough. The people there, mountain people, are different. They keep to themselves, mostly. Don't bother anyone, but you better not bother them. And over the years, I'd heard stories. Stories about meth labs hidden deep in the woods, about traps and dangers no tourist or city folk would understand. I never paid much attention. I figured it was just rumors. That changed on a camping trip I took in late June, just after work let out for a long weekend. I had my gear packed, a basic setup. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water filter, the usual. I wanted to get away from everything, go deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. No cell signal, no people, no noise but the wind and the birds. I picked a spot I'd read about in some old trail guides, a place not on any official map, tucked away on a ridge between two small hollows. Promised privacy. The hike in was tough. Steep climbs, thick underbrush, and more ticks than I cared to count. But the views were worth it. Rolling green hills fading into distant mountains, the air thick with pine and earth. I set up camp on a flat patch near a creek that trickled down the rocks. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the sun warmed the clearing through breaks in the trees. That first night, I made a small fire and cooked canned chili. The stars were clear and bright, and the quiet was peaceful. No cars, no planes, just nature. The next day, I planned to explore more before settling back in camp. I packed light and headed up the ridge trail. It was steeper than I thought. The path was overgrown, and I had to push through branches and vines. The air smelled like wet earth and moss. As I climbed, I noticed something strange. Shoes hanging from the branches of a few trees. Not one or two pairs, but several. Old tennis shoes, work boots, a pair of kids' sneakers, all tied by their laces and dangling in the wind. I stopped and looked around. The shoes swung gently, tapping each other in the breeze. No other campers were near, no kids playing. Just these strange, empty shoes hanging in the woods. A little further up, I saw something else. Christmas lights, strung between two trees like someone tried to make a decoration in the middle of the forest. The lights were old and tangled. The plastic bulbs cracked and faded, but they still caught the sunlight. Nearby, I spotted dolls. Rag dolls with missing limbs and worn faces, hanging by strings from branches. Their heads tilted at odd angles, eyes staring blankly into the forest. I got a cold feeling in my stomach. The place didn't feel right. I kept moving, trying to shake it off. I told myself it was probably some kind of mountain superstition or prank. But then I noticed markings on the trees. Not carvings or initials like hikers sometimes leave. These were symbols painted in white and red. Circles, lines, crosses. Some looked like arrows pointing in certain directions. The patterns were repeated on multiple trees, forming a trail deeper into the woods. I kept going a little further, curiosity fighting fear. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell became. A chemical, sharp and sour, mixed with the fresh forest air. It reminded me of bleach or ammonia. I knew enough about meth labs to recognize that smell. I didn't want to believe it. I hoped I was wrong. Then I came upon a clearing. There was a small shack, ramshackle and covered in rusted tin and plywood. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney. Nearby, plastic buckets, empty propane tanks, and glass jars sat scattered on the ground. I saw hoses and tubing running into a shallow trench dug near the cabin. The whole place looked like it had been set up in a hurry but was still very much in use. That's when I noticed the booby traps. Thin wires stretched between trees, barely visible, with small cans and bottles hanging like bells, designed to make noise if disturbed. I stepped carefully, trying not to trip any. The place was rigged to warn whoever was inside if someone was coming. I had been warned about this. I had heard that meth labs in the mountains are often booby-trapped to keep people away, and those who run them are usually paranoid, often addicted themselves, willing to do whatever it takes to protect their operation. My heart was pounding. The idea of running into someone like that, alone and unarmed, terrified me. I wasn't sure what to do. Turn back? but I was already too close, and the path behind me was thick with undergrowth and thorny bushes. I didn't want to get tangled up in those traps. I decided to move fast and stay low. I backtracked a bit, then took a side path I spotted on the other side of the clearing, hoping it would lead me around the shack. As I moved, I saw more signs: discarded syringes, burnt patches of grass, cans of fertilizer. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, not with animals but with danger. The trees seemed to close in, the light dimming under thick canopy. Every snapping twig made me freeze. I kept thinking about the stories I'd heard growing up, how the locals called these people mountain folk, a whole breed apart. Some were harmless, but many were not. Meth addiction was rampant in the area, and when you mixed desperation with guns and chemicals, the results were deadly. I didn't want to be a target. I pushed harder, trying to find a way out of that area and back to my camp. My legs burned, sweat dripped down my back, and my breath came quick. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting just out of sight, maybe an animal, maybe not. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a low voice on a handheld radio, broken and whispery. It was coming from the shack. I froze. The voice said something I couldn't make out clearly, but the tone was tense. I scanned the clearing and saw a man step out from behind the shack. He was thin, wild-eyed, and his clothes hung loose on him. His hands trembled, and he kept glancing toward the trees, like he expected to be followed. He had a pistol holstered on his hip. He moved slowly toward the edge of the clearing and pressed a button on a radio. The crackling voice came back, quiet and urgent. Chief, I think he's got me." The words sent a cold shock through me. I wasn't sure if he was talking about me or someone else, but it was clear he knew I was there. I dropped low behind a fallen log, heart racing. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want to be caught in a meth lab raid or worse. I'd heard of mountain folks who could be violent and unpredictable, especially when high or scared. I made my way back the way I came, slow and careful, avoiding the wires and traps. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of people moving. The forest seemed endless and dark, but I didn't stop until I saw the familiar shape of my tent and the creek. When I got back, I didn't sit by the fire or cook. I drank cold water and packed my things quickly. I was out of there before dark, moving fast through the woods I had come to know so well but now saw with different eyes. The hike out was brutal. Every shadow seemed to watch me. Every noise set me on edge. I didn't stop until I reached my truck hours later, knees shaking, skin crawling with fear and relief. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I found. There was no point. People who don't live in those mountains wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd want to go looking for themselves. I kept it quiet. Since then, I've learned to respect those warnings. The shoes hanging in the woods, the Christmas lights, the dolls, and the markings, they're not decorations. They're signs, warnings. If you're camping anywhere near East Tennessee and you see those signs, you don't stop to take pictures. You don't try to get closer. You turn around and go home. The mountain people are a different breed, often fighting their own demons, and they don't welcome strangers in their territory. It's not just about being polite, it's about survival. That trip changed how I see the woods. It's beautiful, yes, but it can also be dangerous in ways you don't expect. Not from bears or storms, but from people desperate enough to protect their secret lives by any means necessary. I still love the mountains, but I'm more careful now. I don't go off trails without good reason. I watch for those signs, and I always carry my gun, because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the wilderness itself. It's what people do to survive inside it. I've been camping for years. I know the woods. I know what's normal and what's not. But I've never seen anything quite like what I found one summer night deep in the Appalachian foothills. It was the kind of experience that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I was driving back home from a short week-long trip in East Tennessee, a place I'd visited a few times before for the quiet and the chance to get away from everything. This trip was supposed to be the same, just me, my tent, and a couple of trail snacks. I had planned to camp at a spot a few miles from the town of Tellico Plains, somewhere in the Cherokee National Forest. The place was supposed to be quiet, tucked back from any real trail, with no cell signal and no other campers. I arrived in the early afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and started hiking in. The path was narrow and dusty, winding through thick woods filled with tall oaks, pines, and birch trees. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. I passed a few broken-down cabins and old abandoned trucks covered in moss, signs that this land was still lived on by folks who knew it better than any visitor. After about 2 miles, I reached a clearing near a small creek. I set up my tent there, strung a clothesline between 2 trees, and hung my damp clothes to dry. I liked the spot because it was flat and close to water. The quiet was intense, the kind that seeps into your skin and makes every sound stand out. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the snap of a twig somewhere distant. That night, I built a small fire, cooking canned beans and rice. The flames flickered, casting long shadows over the trees. The stars were sharp and clear, felt peaceful, safe. The next morning, I decided to explore a bit more before breaking camp. I packed a small day bag, water, some granola bars, a map, and a compass, and headed further into the woods, following a faint trail that I hoped would loop back to my campsite. After hiking for about an hour, the trail became less defined. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush was dense with briars and ferns. The light filtered weakly through the canopy, casting a greenish tint over everything. Then I saw them. Hanging from the branches of several trees were dolls. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. Plastic dolls, rag dolls, baby dolls, some missing limbs, some with cracked faces and tangled hair. They swung silently in the breeze, their blank eyes staring straight ahead, their clothes faded and torn. It was one of the most unsettling sights I've ever seen in the woods. I stopped cold. I scanned the area, looking for any signs of people. There was no cabin, no path, no footprints, just the dolls hanging there like some kind of eerie display. I wanted to take a step back, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Why would anyone hang dolls like this? Was it some kind of sick joke? A warning? A marker? I remember thinking, dangling dolls on the trees is possibly the most terrifying marker they could have used. At least try something neutral like Hot Wheels or something, right? But there was nothing neutral about this. The ground beneath the trees was littered with scraps. Broken toys, empty liquor bottles, cracked jars, and old cans. The smell was sharp and chemical-like, mixed with the dampness of the forest floor. I could hear a faint buzzing nearby, like flies hovering around. I looked closer and saw that some of the dolls had been tied with thin wire or string. A few had little tags attached to their wrists, torn pieces of paper with scribbles I couldn't make out. I didn't want to touch anything. The whole place felt wrong. Suddenly, I noticed markings on the trees nearby, scratches and paint forming strange symbols. X's, circles, and arrow-like shapes pointing deeper into the woods. It was clear this wasn't just random. Someone had deliberately put these things here. I remembered hearing about meth labs hidden in these mountains, the kind of places where people cook drugs in secret and protect their territory with traps and signs. I'd read warnings online and in local papers, advice from park rangers and sheriffs not to approach strange signs like these. I started to back away slowly, my heart pounding. But then I saw something else. A thin wire stretched low between 2 trees, almost invisible. It was part of a trap, designed to trip someone walking through. I froze and carefully stepped over it. I realized this was a warning zone, a perimeter set up to keep people out, and whoever put those dolls there wasn't messing around. I didn't want to be caught in whatever this was, so I turned around and headed back the way I came, eyes peeled for any other traps. My pace quickened, adrenaline kicking in. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified. The snap of a branch underfoot, the whistle of wind through the leaves, the distant call of a crow. I felt watched. I reached the creek and took a breath, trying to calm down. The sun was lower now, casting longer shadows through the trees. I gathered my things from the campsite quickly, dreading the hike back to the truck. As I packed up, I spotted something hanging just beyond my tent. A doll. This one was cleaner than the others. A soft plastic baby doll with a painted smile and wide blue eyes. It swung slowly on a low branch, as if left there deliberately for me to see. I I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my pack and left the clearing as fast as I could. The walk back was long and tense. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. I stayed on the trail, avoiding any offshoots. My legs ached from the rough terrain, but I didn't stop until I saw my truck parked at the trailhead. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back at the forest edge, the trees dark and silent. That trip left a mark on me. I know now that the woods hold secrets not just of animals and weather, but of people. And those people can be dangerous in ways you don't expect. The dolls weren't just toys. They were a message, a warning, a sign of something dark lurking beneath the quiet trees. Something desperate enough to use children's playthings as markers for their territory. Since then, I never camp without checking the area carefully first. I watch for signs. Dolls, shoes, lights, markings, and I don't hesitate to turn back if I see anything suspicious. The mountains are beautiful, but they have edges that cut deep. You have to respect that. The forest isn't just wilderness. It's home to people who live by their own rules, who protect what they have fiercely, and who don't want strangers getting too close. That night with the dolls hanging from the trees taught me to listen to those warnings, to stay sharp, and to remember that sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't wild animals or storms. They're the people hiding in the shadows, marking their territory with silent, unsettling signs. I still love the mountains, but I love them with my eyes wide open. I've spent most of my life around the woods. Growing up in rural Appalachia, camping wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. Some people see the forest as a place to relax, to escape from the noise of the world. Me, I've always seen it as a place where respect matters. The land, the trees, the animals, and the people who live nearby, they all demand respect. You don't disrespect the woods, and you don't disrespect the people who live there. That last part is something a lot of folks don't get until it's too late. It started with a trip I planned alone, deep into the hills of East Tennessee. I wanted to get away, clear my head, and spend some time under the stars. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, some supplies, and a good old-fashioned campfire. I drove my pickup to a small trailhead near a forgotten logging road, the kind of place that only locals know about, the kind where you can hike for miles without seeing a soul. That was the whole point. I set off mid-afternoon, the sun warm on my back and the scent of pine thick in the air. The trail was narrow and winding, the kind that barely looked like a trail. I had to duck under low branches and step over fallen logs. The forest was dense, alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and the soft rustle of wind through leaves. I kept an eye out for wildlife, deer tracks, maybe a fox crossing. But mostly, I walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew these woods. I found a spot a couple of miles in where a small creek trickled through a clearing. It was perfect, flat ground, near water, and shaded by a cluster of tall oaks. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a modest campfire. The kind of fire that flickers softly and warms you without roaring too loud. That first night was calm. The stars spread out in the sky like scattered diamonds. I ate some canned beans warmed over the fire, then settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds. Owls called in the distance, and the creek whispered over rocks. I felt at peace, but peace in these woods is fragile. The next morning, I packed a day bag with water, snacks, a compass, and a small first aid kit. I planned to explore a little further before breaking camp. The sun was bright, filtering through the canopy, and the forest seemed even more alive. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed signs that the area wasn't as empty as it seemed. I saw a few makeshift campsites, old fire pits cold and covered with moss. Some had trash, empty cans, torn plastic bottles, and discarded food wrappers. Not exactly the mark of responsible campers. I shrugged it off, but I kept my guard up. Eventually, the trail faded into thick undergrowth. The trees grew tighter, and the air smelled heavier, damp with the musk of decaying leaves. That's when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A figure. He was standing just off the trail, near a cluster of trees, half hidden in shadow. Tall, rough-looking, wearing a faded jacket and old boots. His eyes locked onto mine instantly, cold and hard. There was no smile, no friendly greeting, just a raw, quiet menace. I didn't move, neither did he. In those woods, that silence can be louder than a shout. I've always believed in being respectful and cautious. I didn't want trouble, and I knew better than to make sudden moves. But something about this man told me that wasn't going to be easy. I remembered an old saying from around those parts. I don't take kindly to those who don't take kindly. It's the way people warn each other about strangers who come into their world with disrespect or danger in mind. I had no intention of being disrespectful. I just wanted to pass through. But this guy's stare was like a challenge. I slowly stepped back, careful not to turn my back. I kept my eyes on him as I moved away from the trail, looking for a safe place to go. The forest suddenly felt claustrophobic, the trees closing in like walls. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it, the first trap. A thin wire stretched low between two saplings, almost invisible in the green underbrush. It was the kind of trap set to catch deer or small game, but it could easily trip a person. I jumped over it, keeping my eyes peeled for more. There were more. Nails driven into tree trunks, sharpened sticks angled in the dirt, loose rocks piled like warning signs. The forest was turning into a minefield. I realized that man wasn't alone. This was someone's territory, marked by traps and warnings. The message was clear: don't come in unless you want trouble. I was alone, no signal on my phone, and miles from any help. My pack felt heavy on my shoulders, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. As the sun began to set, I found a narrow ridge overlooking the creek where I'd camped. I climbed up and sat, trying to plan my next move. The sky was a deep orange fading into purple. The woods around me darkened and thickened with shadows. I thought about the man's eyes, how cold and unreadable they were. What had brought him here? What would happen if he caught me? The forest was no longer just a place of peace. It was a place of danger and warnings. Night came quickly. I built a small fire again, the flames casting flickering light around me. I wrapped myself in my jacket, muscles tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Hours passed. I heard distant sounds, branches breaking, footsteps crunching on dead leaves. Sometimes, a low murmur of voices far away, but no one came close. Sleep was impossible. At first light, I packed up and headed back the way I came, eyes sharp for traps or signs of anyone following. The sun rose slowly, golden and warm, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. When I finally reached my truck, relief washed over me. I checked the back, started the engine, and drove off. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a figure watching from the tree line. That trip taught me more than I wanted to know about the woods and the people who live there. Respect isn't just about nature. It's about the rules carved out in these mountains by those who know them best. There are lines you don't cross, territories you don't invade, and warnings you don't ignore. I don't take kindly to those who don't take kindly isn't just a saying. It's a way of life out here, one that can make the difference between getting out alive or becoming just another story lost in the trees. From that day on, I never took the woods for granted. I learned to watch, listen, and respect every shadow and every silence. Because some lessons are hard, and some warnings come hanging from the trees like broken dolls. Silent, clear, and impossible to forget. I went camping alone in the foothills of the southern Appalachians late in the fall a couple of years ago. It was a trip I had planned for a while, the kind of outing where I wanted to be completely cut off from people. I didn't tell many folks where I was going, just left a note with a friend and said I'd be back in 4 days. No cell signal out there, which was the point. I wasn't after a scenic overlook or a waterfall hike. I just wanted to walk, sleep outside, cook over a fire, and be away from everything for a while. The area I picked was a little-known stretch of land that sat just outside the national forest boundary. The Forest Service roads were rough, but passable with four-wheel drive. I parked my truck along a dead-end spur, locked it up, shouldered my pack, and set off heading north. I spent the first day covering as much ground as I could. I hiked up through pine thickets, crossed a couple of shallow creeks, and climbed a rocky hill that took me through a patch of switchbacks. The trail wasn't official. There were no markers, no blazes, just faint old footpaths and deer trails. The kind of place that saw very little human traffic. By the second day, I was a dozen miles from the truck and hadn't seen a soul. That night, I set up camp in a wide flat clearing at the bottom of a narrow ravine. The place was covered in leaf litter and sheltered by tall hickory trees, which meant less wind, and the stream that ran nearby gave me plenty of water. I built a fire, made dinner, and settled in early. The night passed without anything strange. The next morning, I packed light and went off to explore further up the ravine, following the stream as it curved around the base of a ridge. I didn't bring the whole pack, just water, a snack, my knife, a map, and a small emergency kit. The hike started out easy. I kept close to the water, stepping over mossy stones and logs, moving slow and quiet. Then I started to smell something. It was faint at first, smoky, but sweet. Not like a campfire. It smelled chemical, tangy, like something sour mixed with burning wood. I slowed down and listened. The forest was still, but not quiet. Birds, wind, some leaves moving. Normal stuff, but something felt different. After about 10 more minutes of walking, I saw it. Nestled in a small hollow against the base of the ridge was a still. It wasn't old or rusted out. It was clean, functional. Buckets, barrels, copper piping, and a fire pit still putting off a little heat. The boiler was made out of a converted keg, and several clear plastic jugs sat lined up on a flat rock beside it. I stood still. Everything I'd read online came to mind. I'd never come across one in person before, but I knew the stories. I remembered reading in a thread that you should put a log on the fire as a sign of goodwill. It meant you weren't there to cause trouble. It also meant, technically, that you were now part of it, an accessory. That wasn't a joke. People who made this stuff were protective, sometimes violent. If I had found this, chances were someone knew I had. I looked around slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. No one visible, but that didn't mean much. I wasn't dumb enough to assume I was alone. I didn't want to stick around, but I didn't want to just turn and run either. So I picked up a dry log from the pile stacked against a stump and placed it gently onto the fire. The coals were still red. It hissed a little but caught fast. I stepped back, didn't touch anything else, didn't take pictures, didn't linger. Then I walked. I took a wide route back toward my camp, making sure not to retrace the exact path I came in on. I checked over my shoulder constantly. I listened harder than I ever had before. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. It wasn't just fear. It was something else. The woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. Back at camp, nothing was disturbed. My tent was fine. My food bag still hung where I'd left it. But I didn't feel right. The air felt tighter, heavier. I kept glancing into the trees, scanning for any movement. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire going longer than usual, just sitting with my back to a tree and my headlamp around my neck. I thought about packing up and hiking out right then, but I didn't want to risk stumbling around in the dark. So I waited. Just before sunrise, I broke camp in record time. Everything back into the pack. Fire doused, sight cleared. I started hiking back the way I came, heading straight for the truck. That's when I noticed the first change. On the trail, just off to the side, someone had stuck a branch into the ground with a tied bundle of leaves at the top. It looked deliberate, not trash, not natural, like a marker. I hadn't seen it on the way in. Then, another 100 yards later, I saw a boot print. Not mine. Fresh. Deep heel, like someone stood and shifted their weight right there. I picked up the pace, but tried not to look panicked. I didn't run, just kept moving, steady and alert. 2 hours later, I made it back to the truck. It was untouched, nothing slashed, no windows broken. But sitting on the hood was a single empty liquor bottle, clear glass, with a red plastic cap. Nothing inside. It hadn't been there before. That was the clearest sign of all. I unlocked the truck, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. Back along the road, maybe 30 yards into the woods, a figure. Hard to say what they looked like, dressed in camo or maybe just dark clothes. Still as a statue. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't take a picture. I didn't call anyone. I just drove until I hit the highway. Looking back, I don't think they wanted to hurt me. If they did, they had plenty of chances. But I do think they wanted me to know that they saw me, that they let me leave. That next time, I might not be so lucky. I never went back to that area. There's something about knowing you were watched that stays with you. It gets in your head. Every time I go camping now, I think about that bottle, those prints, that bundle of sticks. And I remember how quiet the woods can get when someone wants you gone. Sometimes, when you find something you're not meant to see, the best you can hope for is that they let you walk away. That time, they did. But only just. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, away from the noise and rush of the city, that feels like the only real way to clear your head. The fresh air, the quiet crackle of the fire, the way the stars fill the sky without any light pollution. It all reminds me what it means to be alive. But that particular trip I took, the one I'll never forget, taught me just how dangerous being alone in the woods can be. Not because of the animals or the weather, but because of people. People who can be far more dangerous than anything nature throws at you. It was early fall when I decided to head out into the forest for a weekend of camping. I wanted to get away from everything, so I picked a spot I'd heard about but never visited. Deep in the mountains, miles off the beaten path. The kind of place where you don't see another soul for hours, if at all. I packed my gear the night before, careful to bring enough food, water, and warm clothes. I told a friend roughly where I was going but kept my plans vague. I liked that feeling of disappearing for a bit. The drive was long, twisting through narrow mountain roads that climbed higher with every mile. I kept my eyes on the scenery. Tall pine trees, rocky outcrops, and distant peaks covered in a thin dusting of early snow. When I finally turned onto a gravel road that led toward the campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with calm. This was the kind of place I'd come for. Quiet, untouched, and isolated. When I arrived at the campground, I noticed it was almost empty. There was just one old car parked far off in a corner, a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. No other tents, no campers in sight. The silence was thick. I set up my tent carefully in a small clearing, clearing away dead leaves and pine needles from the ground to make a comfortable spot. The air was cool, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs as I worked. After setting up, I started to gather firewood. That's when I saw it. A dog, sitting just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It wasn't running toward me or wagging its tail, just sitting perfectly still and staring. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it looked thin, but there was something intense in its eyes that made me uneasy. I moved slowly, not wanting to scare it off or provoke it, but when it kept staring, I made a sudden movement, just a quick step to the side, hoping it would leave. Instead, it started barking wildly, loud and sharp, breaking the quiet of the forest in a way that made my skin crawl. Then, almost immediately, I heard voices, male voices, coming from deeper in the woods, just beyond the clearing. They were close enough to hear clearly, but still hidden by trees and brush. One voice stood out, rough, low, and with a hint of menace. "Oh, we're gonna have some fun tonight." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Fun? Out here? That didn't sound like the kind of fun any camper wanted to be part of. My heart pounded and my mind raced. I grabbed my pack and tent poles and started tearing down my camp as fast and quiet as I could. The dog's barking was growing louder, and the voices were getting closer. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was coming. I just packed up everything, shoved it into my car, and drove away faster than I'd ever driven on those winding mountain roads. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or someone following me, but there was nothing. The road ahead was empty, and the quiet night swallowed the sounds behind me. I felt a cold sweat on my back and hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I made it to the nearest town, a small place with a gas station and a diner still open late. I went inside, trying to calm down with a cup of coffee. The owner noticed me, saw the look on my face, and asked if I was all right. I didn't say much, just nodded and told him I was glad to be out of those woods. Later, when I got back home, I reported the whole thing to the sheriff's office. About the dog, the voices, the threatening words. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything more. No arrests, no warnings, nothing. It was like the whole thing had disappeared. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. That man, whoever he was, could have hurt me, could have stopped me from leaving that clearing and disappearing into the night. And he probably could have done it without anyone ever finding out. The woods are wild, sure, but people like him, they're the real danger. After that night, I never went camping alone again. I started going in groups or sticking to well-known campgrounds where there were rangers and other campers around. I kept a better eye on my surroundings, learned to listen to my instincts even more closely. If something felt wrong, I didn't argue with it. I turned around and left. Camping is supposed to be peaceful, a break from the stress of everyday life. But sometimes the peace can be broken in ways you never expect. And when it is, you have to be ready to get out fast. That night in the Sierras stayed with me. It reminded me that even when you think you're safe, even when you're in a place you think you know, danger can be lurking just beyond the trees, watching and waiting. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and something terrible is how you handle yourself in those moments. The way you stay calm, the way you don't show fear. Because some people don't take kindly to those who don't take kindly. And out there, in the dark, that can mean the difference between walking away alive or not walking away at all. I was driving along Highway 395, winding through the Sierras. The sun was starting to dip low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the jagged peaks and pine forests. I'd been on the road all day, my mind restless and tired. I needed a break, a place to set up camp for the night and get some real rest. A few miles off the highway, I spotted a small sign that read campground. It looked old, weathered, like something forgotten by time. I thought it might be quiet, and maybe I'd get some peace away from the busy spots down near the highway. I turned off onto a dirt road that led in between thick stands of fir and cedar, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. When I reached the campground, the place was empty except for one old car parked in a spot not far from the entrance. It was a faded, rusty sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. I didn't see anyone around. The air smelled like pine needles and wet earth, with a cool mountain breeze that carried the faint scent of campfire smoke from somewhere far off. I picked a flat spot near the edge of the campground, close enough to the forest so I'd have some shelter from the wind. The ground was soft with a thick carpet of fallen pine needles and moss. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the stakes were tight and the rainfly was secure. My hands were tired but steady. I lit a small fire in the old ring of stones left behind by other campers. The flames flickered orange and yellow, crackling softly in the quiet. I settled down on a log nearby, drinking water and eating some beef jerky, the fire casting warm light over the trees. That's when I noticed it, a dog. It wasn't running or playing. It just appeared, stepping silently out from behind a clump of bushes at the far edge of the campground. The dog was medium-sized, maybe a bit thin, with shaggy fur that looked dirty and matted. Its eyes were sharp and fixed on me, watching every move with a stillness that made my skin crawl. The dog didn't bark or wag its tail. It just stood there, motionless, staring at me like it was waiting for something. I stayed still too, not wanting to scare it off just yet. But after a few minutes, the silence started to feel heavy, like the calm before a storm. The dog's eyes didn't move. I slowly reached for a stick nearby and made a sudden movement, throwing it a short distance to the side. The dog's reaction was immediate. It let out a fierce bark that shattered the quiet, loud and angry, echoing against the trees. It barked again and again, deep and sharp, sounding more like a warning than a friendly call. Then, just as I was starting to feel uneasy, I heard voices. They came from somewhere deeper in the woods, low and rough. Male voices, talking and laughing softly, the sound carrying clearly through the cold mountain air. I froze, straining to hear what they were saying. One voice stood out, calm but filled with a kind of quiet menace. "Oh, we're gonna have some fun tonight." My heart dropped. I didn't wait around to hear more. I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before, stuffing my gear into my backpack with trembling hands. The dog kept barking, as if urging me to hurry. I grabbed my tent poles and rolled up sleeping bag and shoved everything into the back of my truck. As I started the engine, the dog didn't move from its spot, still watching me like a sentinel. The voices in the woods grew louder, closer, as if the men were moving toward the campground. The light was fading fast now, the sky darkening into twilight. I peeled out of there, tires spinning on loose gravel, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the highway again. The familiar hum of cars and bright streetlights, a stark contrast to the dark woods I'd just left behind. That night, lying in a cheap motel bed miles away, I replayed everything over and over. The dog's cold stare, the way it barked to warn me, and that voice, calm but deadly. I never found out who those men were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places in the mountains are better left alone, no matter how quiet or empty they look. It wasn't a story about ghosts or monsters. It was about people. Real, dangerous people who live off the grid, who don't welcome strangers, and who don't take kindly to anyone who stumbles onto their turf. From then on, I learned to trust those instincts. The small warnings in a dog's eyes, the sounds carried on the wind, and the silence that feels too heavy to ignore. Because sometimes the real danger isn't in the dark. It's in the things you see and hear and know are wrong, but don't fully understand until you're already in too deep. I still love the Sierras, but I know now that the mountains hold secrets. Some are just stories, but others are warnings carved into the landscape, waiting for the right person to listen before it's too late. I was in the Boy Scouts when this happened, probably around 13 or 14 years old. I'd been in the Scouts for a couple of years by then and had already earned a fair number of merit badges, but the one that really pushed my limits mentally and physically was the Wilderness Survival Merit Badge. It wasn't just the skills it required, but the challenge it presented. That badge wasn't just about theory or checking off tasks during weekend meetings. It meant going out into the woods, sleeping away from the comforts of a tent or sleeping cabin, and doing it all with your own hands. The requirement that really stood out was building a shelter and sleeping in it on your own, out in the wilderness. Not just behind the main camp or a few feet off the trail, but a couple miles out. You had to gather natural materials, build something functional enough to get through the night, and then actually stay in it until morning. That summer, our troop went on a week-long campout in a pretty remote part of the state. It wasn't anything extreme like Alaska or deep in the Rockies, but it was enough to feel cut off from everything else. No cell reception, no nearby towns, no traffic hum in the background. Just woods, birds, and the occasional rustle in the leaves. The main campsite was a large clearing with several permanent fire pits, wooden benches, a cooking area, and designated tent spaces. There were about 30 of us, give or take, between the Scouts and the adult leaders. It was a good group. Some of the older boys had already earned their Eagle rank, and there were a few younger ones just getting started. I was somewhere in the middle, old enough to know the ropes, young enough to still feel intimidated by what lay beyond the edges of our lantern light. We spent most of the week doing the usual things, learning knots, working on fire building, identifying edible plants, practicing navigation with map and compass. Everything was leading up to the final night, Wilderness Survival Night. 8 of us were doing the merit badge. We'd spent the day hiking out to a remote area with one of the adult leaders. He showed us a stretch of woods about 2 miles from the base camp, near a shallow creek. It was a good spot. Lots of branches and leaves for shelter making, soft ground for sleeping, and just enough light through the trees that you didn't feel totally swallowed by the forest. Still, the farther we got from camp, the quieter it got. No voices, no fire crackle, just wind and bugs. I remember feeling my chest get tight as we dropped our gear. The adult leader told us he'd be back to check on us in the morning. Then he turned around and walked away. I remember watching him disappear down the trail. It was early evening. The sun hadn't set yet, but everything in me felt like it was night already. We got to work building our shelters. The plan was simple enough: use what was around. I found a small space between two fallen logs, kind of like a natural alcove, and leaned a bunch of branches over it. I added pine boughs and leaves for insulation, then laid down a space blanket over some more pine needles to sleep on. It wasn't cozy, but it was dry and low to the ground. It gave me a sense of enclosure, which helped with the nerves. The other boys made shelters scattered in the general area. We weren't all in a tight group, but we could see each other through the trees, maybe 20 to 40 feet apart, depending on who had wandered off a bit for better shelter spots. Once we were done, we sat around a small fire someone had made using a bow drill. We talked for a bit, just normal stuff, joking, complaining about the bugs, guessing how cold it would get that night. I didn't talk much. I was already on edge and just trying to act like I was fine. I couldn't stop thinking about being out there all night. No tents, no adult supervision, no backup plan. As it got darker, one by one, the others drifted off to their shelters. I waited a little longer, then finally crawled into mine. I lay there for a while, listening to the fire sputter out. It was weird how different everything sounded. The forest at night wasn't dead quiet, it was just unfamiliar. The creaks of trees shifting in the wind, the constant hum of insects, the odd distant bird call. It wasn't that anything sounded dangerous, just strange. When you're used to sleeping indoors or even in a tent with others nearby, your brain treats that as a safe zone. But out there, every sound made me tense. I lay there for hours, or at least it felt like hours. I kept looking at my watch with a little flashlight, trying to calculate how many more hours until sunrise. At some point, I must have dozed off. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember being suddenly wide awake. What woke me up wasn't a loud sound. It was more like my brain decided something wasn't right. And then I heard it. From a nearby shelter, probably 20 feet to my right, I heard someone shout. Not just a word or a grunt, but clear and terrified yelling. A boy's voice, one of the other scouts. "No, please, get away. Stop, don't." Then silence. It was the kind of thing that instantly pushes all the air out of your lungs. I froze completely still. My heart was hammering in my ears. I didn't even sit up. I just stared toward the sound, eyes wide, trying to make out anything through the dark. I whispered, almost hissed out loud, "Hey!" Nothing. No rustling, no movement, no reply. I remember feeling so utterly alone at that moment. There were 7 other boys around me, but it felt like I was the only one left alive. My brain spiraled. Was someone out there? Had we been followed? Was there some psycho in the woods? I imagined everything from a bear to a lunatic with a knife. It was irrational, but at the same time, the fear was completely real. I waited, holding my breath, expecting to hear more. A scream, footsteps, anything. But there was only silence. Slowly, I sat up and looked around. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness a bit, and I could make out the vague shapes of shelters and trees. No movement. I didn't hear anyone else stir. Somehow, that yell hadn't woken a single other person. Just me. And that's what made it worse. I wanted to shout again, but something in me hesitated. What if I was drawing attention to myself? What if something or someone was actually out there? I sat there for what felt like forever, listening. Then I heard a faint mumble from the same direction, almost like someone muttering in their sleep. Then a light snore. That's when it hit me. It had been a night terror, a nightmare. Someone had been sleep-talking, maybe acting out their dream a bit. It explained everything. The shouting, the sudden silence, the lack of response. It wasn't an attack. It was just a kid dreaming. That realization hit me like a wave of relief, but my body didn't calm down right away. I was still tense, still sweating. I sat there in my shelter, knees pulled up, for at least another hour, just staring out into the dark. Eventually, I lay back down. I didn't fall asleep again. I just waited for the sun to come up. When morning came, and the adult leader showed up to check on us, everything was fine. Everyone was accounted for. Nobody even mentioned the yelling. I looked around at the others, trying to figure out who it might have been, but nobody looked like they'd had a rough night. Everyone was talking and laughing like it had been no big deal. I wanted to bring it up, but I kept it to myself. Stuck with me, though, not just the yelling, but the fact that I'd been the only one awake to hear it. The only one who thought we were in real danger. It felt like I'd been alone in a different world for a few minutes. A place where something terrible was about to happen. Over the years, I've slept outside more times than I can count. I've been in more remote places through worse weather, around animals, and with less gear. But nothing has ever rattled me like that night. That moment when your brain flips the switch from discomfort to raw fear, and you realize how thin the line really is between feeling safe and feeling completely exposed. I earned the merit badge. I even got a compliment from the leader about how well my shelter held up overnight. But I didn't feel proud. I just felt relieved that it was over. To this day, I still think about that night. The voice, the panic, the silence after. And every time I sleep outside, no matter how many years have passed, I think about how quickly your mind can convince you that you're not alone, that something is out there, even if it's just a dream from the next shelter over. I had gone out to camp and hunt for the weekend, like I had done plenty of times before. Just me, my gear, my shotgun, and some open land where I could walk for miles without seeing another person. That was how I liked it. There was something about the quiet out there that I couldn't get anywhere else. No ringing phones, no cars buzzing by, no news, no noise. Just trees, hills, the rustle of wind through dry grass, and the soft crunch of my boots on the trail. I drove out Friday morning, got to the general area by early afternoon, and found a good spot to park and set up camp. I wasn't deep in the mountains, but far enough off the main roads that I wouldn't run into anyone unless they were out there for the same reason. It was public land, but remote. The kind of place where it felt like the forest wrapped around you and shut out the world. I pitched my tent not far from a dry creek bed, laid out my sleeping bag, and prepped my gear for the next day. I planned to spend Saturday walking ridge lines and brushy valleys looking for upland birds. It was still early season, and the weather was warm and dry. Perfect for a long walk with a shotgun over your shoulder. The next morning I got up early, made coffee over a small stove, ate a quick breakfast, and packed a day pack with water, some jerky, a first aid kit, and extra shells. I wore a blaze orange vest even though I didn't expect to see anyone. You just never know. Better to be seen than mistaken for game. I started walking before the sun had fully cleared the trees. My plan was to head north, cross a low ridge, and drop down into a series of gullies where I'd had some luck in the past. The land out there is open in parts, thick with brush in others. You walk a lot, sometimes all day without firing a shot. I liked that part of it. I moved slow and steady, listening, watching. Every now and then I stopped, scanned the edges of clearings for any movement, then moved on. I was about 3 hours into my hike when I came to a narrow valley, more like a depression than a proper valley, but deep enough that I figured it would be a good shortcut to the next area I wanted to hunt. I started down the trail, dry grass brushing my legs, the scent of dust and sun-baked sage strong in the air. About halfway through the valley, I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped cold. There was a man standing there, maybe 15 yards ahead. He was holding an AR-15 in the ready position, not pointed at me but not lowered either. He wasn't dressed for hunting. No orange, no camo. He wore torn jeans, an old flannel shirt, boots caked in dust. His hair was greasy and matted, and his beard was wild, like it hadn't been trimmed or washed in weeks. His skin looked weathered and tight, like he hadn't had much water or sleep lately. He looked rough, dangerous. The second I saw him, every hair on my neck stood up. My stomach turned cold. My hand stayed near my shotgun, but not on it. I knew I couldn't outdraw him if it came to that. I also knew that one wrong move could turn the moment into something very different. I stood still. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I kept my face neutral, not smiling, not scared, just plain. Inside, I was scared out of my mind. My legs felt weak, but I knew better than to show it. I tried to think fast. He looked like he had nothing to lose, and those are the kind of people who scare me the most. He hadn't said anything, just stared. I didn't want to ask what he was doing. I didn't want to challenge him, so I played dumb. I said I was looking for birds, hoping he'd just tell me to go a certain way and let me be. My voice sounded too calm, like it wasn't even mine, but I meant every word. I was hoping that if I acted like this was just a normal meeting on a trail, he wouldn't have a reason to escalate things. I was trying to give him an easy way to end it. He answered slowly, like he was thinking it through. His eyes didn't soften. He said he was hunting deer. That hit me sideways. Deer season wasn't open yet, and even if it was, an AR-15 isn't legal for deer hunting where I was. Plus, he didn't have any gear. No pack, no license tags, nothing. Just a guy out in the bush with a military-style rifle and a 1,000-yard stare. He didn't say much else, but the way he said I should head back the way I came. That hit me hard. The tone in his voice made it clear. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I turned around slowly, like I was just taking his advice, and started walking back the way I had come. Every step felt heavy. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, or worse. I didn't run. I didn't look over my shoulder. I just walked, steady and calm, like I didn't have a care in the world. It took me about 20 minutes to reach higher ground again. I never saw him follow, but I didn't stop moving until I was well clear of that whole area. I walked for another hour, not even paying attention to birds or tracks or anything else, just trying to put as much space between me and that valley as I could. Eventually, I found a good clearing, sat down, drank some water, and let my nerves catch up. That's when it hit me, how close it had been. That man could have easily pulled the trigger. He could have shot me, taken my gear, and vanished. No one would have found me for days, maybe longer. And out there, even if they had, maybe it would have looked like a hunting accident, or nothing at all. But he didn't. For whatever reason, he let me go. Maybe he saw something in me that made him think I wasn't a threat. Maybe he just didn't feel like it that day. I don't know, and I never will. But I know I walked away. I know I kept calm. And I know I never want to be in that situation again. I hiked straight back to my camp, packed everything up without taking a break, and drove out before the sun set. I got back to town late that night, and the next morning I called the sheriff's office. I told them exactly what had happened, the location, the man, the weapon, what he said. They took the report and said they'd send someone out to check. I never heard anything else. No follow-up, no news. I don't know if they found him or if they even went out there. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. I think about that day more often than I'd like. I think about how quickly things can go wrong. How one moment you're walking a trail looking for birds, and the next you're staring down a man who looks like he hasn't slept in days, holding a rifle like he's waiting for a reason. Changed how I hunt. I still go out, but I stay closer to marked trails. I go with a buddy when I can. And I never, ever take shortcuts through valleys I haven't scouted before. That quiet out there, that peace I used to chase, it feels different now. There's a shadow in it. A reminder that even when the forest looks empty, it might not be. And that some people you meet out there aren't just passing through. I was surprised it happened. Surprised I stayed calm. And surprised that nothing worse came of it. But that's the thing about the wild. You don't control what it gives you. You just try to get out of it in one piece. I don't know if it was pride or stubbornness that made me ignore the signs. Maybe both. I'd hiked alone plenty of times before. Up in the Sierra Nevada, along the Pacific Northwest, even in parts of Colorado where the weather could change in an instant. So when I told my friend Jake I'd be heading up to Red Willow Canyon alone for a weekend, he gave me that look and said, "Just don't be stupid. That's mountain lion country." I told him I'd be fine. I'd read all the safety tips. I had a solid fixed blade knife strapped to my belt, pepper spray in my side pocket, a whistle, a titanium camping mug that could double as a noisemaker, and a first aid kit with everything I could need. I even had my emergency beacon, though I'd only ever turned it on once as a test. I thought I was prepared. The trail into Red Willow was old logging road turned hiker-only path, quiet, narrow, and deep in the pines. Not many folks came out here since it was several hours from the nearest town, and the forest hadn't been logged since the 70s. The trees were tall and packed in close, so thick in some parts that it looked like late evening even at noon. I liked the solitude. No people, no noise, just the woods. It was a 3-day, 2-night trip. I had a simple plan. Hike in 7 miles to a known camp clearing near the base of a ridge, set up camp, spend the next day exploring some off-trail ridges I'd scouted on a topo map, and then hike back out. It wasn't remote by Alaska standards or anything, but it was still far enough off-grid that there was no cell service. You either handled yourself or didn't. The first day went fine. I saw a few deer and a black squirrel that followed me for nearly a quarter mile. It was cold, mid-30s, and patches of old snow lingered in the shaded areas, especially north-facing slopes. I followed the trail up and over a shallow rise, past an old logging scar, and by late afternoon I reached the clearing. It wasn't much, just a flat spot by a creek with enough room for a tent, a fire ring made of stones, and a few logs arranged like benches. Looked like it had been used recently, maybe in the last month or so. Some dry kindling and half-burned logs were still in the ring. I set up camp like I always do. Tent under a thick pine, food hung about 20 feet away on a slanted limb using paracord. Fire started with dry pine needles and birch bark, water filtered from the creek. Nothing fancy. I even had a small flask of whiskey to sip once it got dark. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how peaceful. Then I noticed the deer tracks near the creek, crossing over mine from earlier. But here's the thing, they were fresh. Too fresh. I'd just been down there 10 minutes ago filling my bottle, and the tracks hadn't been there. The prints were small, sharp, probably a doe. Nothing strange in itself, but I got that weird tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. I looked up at the ridge behind my camp, just a steep slope covered in brush and boulders. That's when I noticed the silence. The wind had stopped, and I didn't hear birds. No squirrels, no creak of branches. It was dead quiet. I scanned the ridge but saw nothing. No movement. Still, I felt watched. I don't mean in a creepy, paranoid way. I mean the way you feel when something is actually watching you. The hairs on my neck stood up, my stomach tensed. I stood there, staring at the slope, gripping my knife's handle through the sheath. Nothing moved. I shook it off. Told myself I was just being jumpy. I've been alone for a while. Sometimes the brain plays tricks. I walked back to camp, threw a few more sticks on the fire and sat down. But I didn't take my boots off. I kept them laced. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises. Nothing definite, just soft cracks of branches. A whisper of movement through dry leaves. Every time I unzipped the tent and looked out with my headlamp, I saw nothing. But it never stopped. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, light and uneasy. The next morning was gray and cold. I made instant coffee and oatmeal and sat on the log, watching mist rise off the creek. I wanted to go explore the off-trail ridges like I'd planned, but I hesitated. That feeling from the day before hadn't left me. Still, I was out there to hike. I packed a small day bag with food, water, a map, and some gear, and I left my tent standing. I set off north, up the slope behind my camp, through thick underbrush and deadfall. The climb was tough but manageable. About halfway up, I stopped for a break. That's when I saw the tracks. Not the deer again. This time they were rounder, wider. Paw prints. I knelt to look closer. For toes. No claws. Too big to be a bobcat. It was a mountain lion, and it had come down the slope. The direction of the toes pointed toward my camp. I followed the tracks for about 10 yards. They moved straight, deliberate. No hesitation. Whatever it was, it had walked within 50 feet of where I'd slept. I pulled out my knife and scanned the woods slowly. Every branch and rock suddenly looked like a crouching shape. I stood still, listening. The wind picked up a little, and I heard a raven call in the distance. Still no sign of anything alive around me. I considered turning back right then, but I told myself maybe it had passed through. Maybe it was already miles away. I kept going slow, quiet. Every 20 steps or so, I'd stop and listen. At one point, I banged my metal mug against a rock, just in case anything was nearby. The sound echoed through the trees like a bell. Around midday, I reached the ridge summit. The view was worth it. Hundreds of acres of pines stretching out below, the creek winding like a ribbon through the forest. I sat on a boulder, ate a protein bar, and tried to relax. But something was wrong. I could feel it again. that sense of being watched. I scanned every direction but saw nothing. Still, I decided I'd seen enough for one day. I didn't linger. I started back down the ridge the way I came, this time gripping the knife in my hand, unsheathed. The descent was slower, every step deliberate. I paused often, checking behind me. At one point, I turned sharply and thought I saw movement behind a log about 30 yards back. But when I looked again, it was just a shadow. I kept moving. I made it back to camp by late afternoon. The fire ring was undisturbed. My tent was still there, but the area felt wrong. I did a slow circle around my camp, checking the ground. I found more tracks, not fresh, maybe from the night before. They circled the clearing. A big cat had been pacing, watching. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to attract anything. I sat in the tent with the rain fly pulled back so I could see out. The moon was out, pale and cold. I had my knife, my whistle, and my mug. I didn't drink any whiskey. I didn't eat dinner. Around midnight, I heard it. A low growl, not close but not far either. It didn't sound like a coyote. It was deep, slow, measured. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, hand gripping the knife. Then silence again. For almost an hour, I heard footsteps, soft, padded. Not crunching, just brushing over the dead needles. Something moved around the edge of my camp. Not fast, just circling. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then the noise stopped. Nothing. For another hour. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright until dawn, knife in hand. When the sun finally rose, weak and gray, I stepped outside and looked around. No fresh prints, no blood, no torn gear, just the trees and silence. That was enough. I packed everything fast, double-checked my surroundings, and started back down the trail. I kept checking behind me. At one point, halfway back, I stopped to listen and heard a branch snap uphill from me. I froze. I raised my arms slowly, spread my jacket wide, and shouted. A low, rough bark echoed from the trees. Not a dog. A cougar's warning. I picked up a metal pot from my pack and banged it hard against a rock. The sound cracked through the forest. I did it again and again. I yelled louder, growled, made as much noise as I could. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, just like that, I heard it run off. The sound of claws on dirt and then silence. I didn't stop again until I reached the trailhead. Back at my truck, I sat in the cab for 10 minutes before starting it. My hands were shaking. I don't know how close I was to being attacked. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it had been stalking me for a day and a half. I'll never know. What I do know is this: when they say don't run, they mean it. When they say make yourself big, make noise, carry something sharp, you do it. And if your gut tells you something's wrong, it probably is. I haven't camped alone since.